I think we'll go ahead and get started. Can you hear me okay? I'm Marty Perry, the Chief Economist, and good morning. We're pleased to have Joe Stiglitz with us today as our distinguished speaker. Joe's done almost everything that you can do as an economist and maybe a little bit more. He's been a professor of economics at Yale, Stanford, Oxford, Princeton, Stanford again, and now Columbia University. I first met Joe at Stanford as a graduate student. He's published hundreds of papers in economics journals on topics of economic growth, public economics and taxation, distribution of income and wealth, international trade, macroeconomics, and even my favorite field, industrial organization. Joe was awarded the Nobel Prize for economics in 2001, primarily for his work in what's a field called the economics of information. He was one of the pioneers in this field. He applied this field to a number of different problems in economics, financial markets, issues of credit rationing and lending, labor markets, efficiency wages as an explanation for unemployment, applied it in insurance markets, and of course education. Joe's even written a couple of successful textbooks, an introductory textbook and a textbook on the economics of the public sector. During the Clinton administration, Joe came to Washington, first as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors and then the chairman of the council from 1993 to 97, and then he moved on to the World Bank as senior vice president and chief economist there from 1997 to 2000. Based on those experiences, Joe's written two very interesting recent books. The first book, Globalization and Its Discontents, discusses economic problems in less developed countries caused by policies of rapid privatization, reduction of trade barriers, and liberalization of capital markets. Very interesting reading. And his most recent book, The Roaring 90s, focuses more on the United States economy, looking at issues of why we experienced the bubble and the causes of that. And both are great readings. I'm finished one and halfway through the other. So I'm not exactly sure what Joe's going to talk about today, but that's one of the reasons we invited him. True to his research, he brings us a little bit of uncertainty and imperfect information. So with that, I'll introduce Joe Stiglitz.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Rather than have a coherent talk, I'm going to talk a potpourri of topics that are mostly reflections on some of the debates we had in the Clinton administration on telecom reform in the period 93-95, now almost a decade ago, as well as some reflections on my experiences at the World Bank and since on some of the international dimensions of the issues with which you've been concerned here. And there are four specific topics I'm going to talk about. I'll begin by talking about competition. The debate that we had at the time, there's a small group of us in the White House that were talking about the new telecommunications bill before it was the new bill, and debating it. One of the topics that we debated most actively was what was going to happen to competition and what was needed to preserve, to maintain competition. And there were two very different schools of thought, even within the administration. Everybody believed in competition. I mean, that was, everybody thought that was a good thing. There was nobody saying, oh, it's great, we're going to have monopolies. There's nobody that took that position. The view that with monopolies you can get more, extract more rents or anything like that. That was not a view that any of us held. The two views were, one held that technology was changing so fast, with so many new entrants, new technologies, that competition would break out on its own, and you didn't you no longer needed government regulation. It was no longer, you were no longer, in telephoning, you were no longer going to have a natural monopoly. So that the best thing for the government would be to do is just fade away out of this area. A little oversight for the FCC, but don't get antitrust involved. Don't get the Department of Justice. They don't understand things. That was just unnecessary trouble. The other view was that we couldn't predict exactly how things were going to work out, and that somehow the forces that suppress competition manage to prevail no matter what is going on, that somehow they work in mysterious ways, but that we should worry about competition, and not to criticize the FCC. We worried about capture of the FCC by particular interest, and that as a result of that, there needed to be some oversight by the Department of Justice. And that, so the debate was what was going to be the role of the Department of Justice in maintaining competition. One of the reasons that I was particularly concerned about this issue was some theoretical work that I had done in the 80s, which showed that competition, particularly in markets, in industrial structures, essentially characterized the telephone, telecommunications, that competition was extremely fragile. There was a paper that I had shown where if you had even small sunk costs, epsilon sunk costs, arbitrarily small, that you could have a monopoly, some costs that they would be a sufficient entry barrier that you could maintain monopoly power. And that work had actually arisen out of a debate several years before that associated with the breakup of AT&T at Bell Labs. The question was, did you need to, again, worry about oversight, competition oversight? There was a view that many people at AT&T liked, which was that these markets were contestable, and that so long as they were contestable, even if there was a single firm in the industry, even if there was a single telephone company, it couldn't exercise monopoly power. And the idea was that if it tried to exercise monopoly power, raise prices a little bit above average cost, there would be entry that would displace it. And so this view that you didn't need to worry about even natural monopolies, people like Bobby Willig, Will Baumol advocated this, had a sort of natural implausibility to it. That is to say, that somehow you didn't think that if a telephone company was in place and it charged a little bit of monopoly power, somebody would come in and completely displace it. But that was the view that was held. Interestingly, in the one example that they always gave, they didn't push the example of telephone too hard, although that was the motivation. That's what paid for the research. The example they talked about was airplanes, airlines, and the view is, again, you didn't need to worry about competition, even if there was a natural monopoly in the route between two locations. That if anybody, this was a real example of easy to have entry. If you raise your price, somebody takes their airplane, moves it into that particular market, and takes it over. So that the argument was you couldn't even you couldn't exercise any monopoly power, even if there was a declining average cost curve, and even if in traditional economics it was called a natural monopoly. Well, since then, I think those who were in charge of deregulating the airlines industry, people like Alfred Kahn and others, have I think come to the view that they were overly optimistic. That some of you may have noticed that prices sometimes are high between a city like Dallas and other cities. That St. Louis, for instance, as a hub, has extremely high air charges, and nobody's entering. And the argument is actually a very simple one that I put forward in my paper. It was that if they believed that competition would be very keen once entry occurred, and that you have these fixed costs, and let's say the simplest model, a constant marginal cost, then once entry occurred, they would compete so intensely that there would be no profits. But with any sunk cost, that would mean that you would lose your sunk cost. So before entry occurs, people recognize that competition was going to drive out profits and they would make a loss, and so they didn't enter. So in a sense, competition itself is a barrier to entry if there are any sunk costs. So that is a part of the explanation, that at least a part of the explanation for why even if there's small sunk costs, there will not be entry. And of course, there are small sunk costs with almost anything you do. If you start flying an airplane, somebody has to know that you're there in the market. They don't know mysteriously, and that means you have to have advertising. You have to have you have to rent an office for a while, and those are all small sunk costs, but they act as a very effective entry barrier. So what we've come to understand is that how fragile competition is, and I think the corresponding point was the side of the argument that I took, which is that you did need to have strong antitrust oversight, I think was correct. In the subsequent years, both the theory and experience has emphasized one other reason why in this arena one has to be particularly sensitive to violations of antitrust, of non-competitive practice, and that is network externalities, nature of networks. Networks are particularly prone to non-competitive behavior, to non-competitive equilibrium. And in a way, one recognizes that there are a whole variety of ways that people can engage in non-competitive behavior, interconnectivity, and quality, and that were some of the issues that had underlay the regional breakup of the AT&T. There was a recognition that it was very hard to regulate it to make sure that it behaved in a good way, and that you needed to break it up. But I think that one is that has helped illustrate the fact that in markets in which there are these strong network externalities, not only is competition not likely to prevail on its own, but it's also very difficult to regulate it, and that there do need to be structural separations. And even then, things will be imperfect. In a way, this is a little bit of an aside. The lessons that we've learned from telephone networks have provided a lot of insight into an area that's probably one of the most important areas in the modern economy that we began to worry about in the early 90s in the Clinton administration, but have turned out to be I think, far worse than we had anticipated, and that is in software, in Microsoft, that operating system, Microsoft, the ability to, the enormous ability to exercise monopoly power and to suppress competitors, and in the long run, with, I think, very adverse effects on innovation. And there now is a clear finding, you know, judges in Washington, European Commission on this, and we've seen it in the case of the browser, we've seen it in the case of the what they're doing to real network, that the issue is not so much that they have been able to suppress competition, but what is the remedy that will work without having undue cost? The evidence on the anti-competitive behavior is clear. The only debate, I think, today is what is the best remedy, and here the issues are I think, extremely complicated and difficult. So I think the first topic that I wanted to raise is this issue on competition. I think there needs to be a continuing concern at the FCC about competition. I think the large numbers of firms is not an assurance that there is going to be a competitive marketplace. You can have large number of firms and still not have competition, effective competition. So I think the mechanisms by which competition is suppressed is something that's an important research topic, and the best ways of ensuring competition also is an important topic. As we were debating these issues in the early 90s, there were a number of things that we didn't anticipate. I think we didn't obviously fully anticipate the growth of the cell phone technology. We thought it would grow. I don't think we anticipated some of the well, obviously the early years, the development of the internet. And all of its implications, some of the federal-state conflicts. But one of the other things that we did not fully anticipate was the role that the new telecom law, you might call it a liberalization in telecom, would play in feeding the bubble of the 90s with such adverse consequences both during the 90s and in the aftermath, and the subject that I spent some time talking about in my book, Roaring 90s. And one of the things I try to argue in the Roaring 90s is that it was very clear that the perspective of many of the market participants was that there was not going to be real competition. And that their belief that there was not going to be real competition is what fed the bubble, what fed the boom. You had competition in the market, for the market, rather than competition in the market. There was a belief that if I was going to be the first mover in the market, I could become dominant and I would get monopoly profits. And it was the search for monopoly profits that drove so much entry, so much expansion. If they really believed that there was going to be competition in the market, and that competition was going to drive down profits to zero, which is what our standard competition theory says, or even if they believed in contestability, so that there's a single firm, but the potential competition lowers prices to a zero profit, then there are two obvious implications. First, it would not pay to lobby so hard. You know, lobbying is an investment activity, and a lot of money was spent on lobbying. Why do you do it? Well, because you expect to get a return. And what is the return? Well, you expect to make some profits. And that is a statement they believe that there was going to be some monopoly profit, some market power. But the real, even more important was the fact that this belief in the first mover advantage, that you get in and you become the dominant firm in the market, and you have these enormous profits. And of course, there was a certain amount of irrational exuberance or a phenomena that as a teacher, I see all the time, about 80% of my students believe that they're in the top half of the class. And that is a good thing because it does help motivate them. They all believe they're going to get, the top grade if they only work a little bit. But the same thing in this area, they all believe that they were better than everybody else, and they all rushed in. Obviously, they all weren't going to be better than everybody else, and that fed the bubble. And as you all, I'm sure, know, the result of this was an enormous excess capacity in areas like fiber optics, enormous misallocation of resources. That excess capacity, represents, at least arguably, a misinvestment. Now, one of the other topics that I talk about in my book, Roaring '90s, is to try to understand a little bit more about why the market mechanism failed so strongly in the '90s to give the right signals. That we all believe the fundamental belief in the market economy is that prices provide the signals for resource allocation to direct resources in an efficient way. It's really the basic premise under which for the market economy. And it's reflected in probably the most important theorem in economics, Adam Smith's invisible hand, that says the price system, the pursuit of profits, the pursuit of self-interest leads as if by an invisible hand to economic efficiency. Well, what my own research in economics of information and other research of others showed that if information is imperfect or asymmetric, that's just a fancy word for saying that different people know different things, which is obviously the case, or I couldn't be talking here. It says that if under these conditions of imperfect information, then the reason the invisible hand often seems invisible is that it's not there. And what was going on in the 90s is that there were systematic incentives in place, systematic structures that not only led to bad information, but led to a distortion in the information. And obviously, if prices are based on bad, distorted information, they're not going to give the signals that you want for efficient resource allocation. So that, one example, at the heart of this argument, for instance, is the problem of stock options. And stock options were fantastic from the point of view of CEOs, executives, because they knew they had value, they received something of value, but it wasn't clear who paid them. So if you can get money and nobody knows where you got money from, that's wonderful. But of course, those of us who take in physics know there's something called the law of conservation of matter. And if somebody gets something, somebody has to, in general, give it. And who was giving it? It was the shareholders. Their shares were being diluted. But the way the accounting frameworks were designed, they didn't know it, or they couldn't calculate how much. The magnitude of this dilution was enormous. And we had, inside the White House and inside, more broadly, a big debate about this. The Council of Economic Advisors, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FASB, all argue for accounting reform. But there were some other people who argue on the other side, like U.S. Treasury. And the kind of argument that they put forward was that if you had this accounting reform, prices would go down. We thought that was an argument for the reform. Because what they said is if people only knew what was going on, they would not value the shares as much as they would. So we thought this was a compelling argument for the reform. But they thought it was an argument against. And of course, what was really going on here was that there was a party, and nobody wanted to be a party pooper. The stock market bubble was just beginning, and they didn't want it to stop. Some people were making an awful lot of money out of it. But our view at the Council, people were a little bit mystified why at the Council of Economic Advisors we were so interested in this issue of accounting. You know, most people think the only thing more boring than economics is accounting. And why were these economists focusing so much on this accounting problem? And the answer is obvious, is very simple, that if you don't have good information, the market system can't do what it's supposed to do. And so that's why we pushed it very strongly, but unfortunately we didn't succeed. And Arthur Levitt, who was the head of the SEC, argues that it was probably, has said that it's probably the worst mistake that he ever made was to give in on this issue. But it was bad not just because it was bad. The problem was not just that it made it more difficult for people to figure out what was going on. It was that it provided incentives for bad information. Because you were the CEO, you have a choice, either coming up with a good project or coming up with bad information that made your company look like it was doing better. And it was a lot easier to give distorted information than to come up with good ideas for good projects. In the 80s, a lot of work, 70s, a lot of work had been done in a broad issue by accountants and tax lawyers of how to avoid taxes. And that was viewed to be a socially productive activity. That, you know, it was viewed to be a good thing to minimize your taxes. And so even if you were not providing good information, it was your responsibility to minimize your taxes. And then the big intellectual breakthrough, really major intellectual breakthrough in the 90s and early 90s was the discovery by corporations that they could cheat their shareholders in the same way that they cheated Uncle Sam. And they quickly took to this with, as they say, like ducks to water. And the ingenuity was really, I think, quite impressive. And I think the business schools have a lot to credit, to claim for this. Our teaching there helped that along a great deal. The accountants, as I say, contributed to the problem. It used to be that in the old days of the 70s and early 80s, that accountants did this very boring stuff that that is to say, they did accounting. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, they discovered there was more money to be made in providing advice. And so their old job had been to certify that the information was accurate. But then there was this change where they figured out that they made more money by providing consulting services. Well, just think about it. If you're hired by the CEO, effectively, and you're paid large amounts of money for providing these consulting services with maybe dubious value but not very big cost, high profitability, there's an obvious conflict of interest. And your incentive is to turn the other way when you see bad information. And what I think the one proposition that economists have that is true is that incentives matter. The economy may not be efficient, but people do respond to incentives. And in this particular case, the incentives were to go along with the CEO. Again, the SEC recognized that there was this conflict of interest. Arthur Levitt pushed to say that a regulation that accountants ought to do accounting, that was viewed to be revolutionary, oppressive, and he was beaten back. But then, of course, after all the problems of Enron, Arthur Andersen came to light, there was something done about it, but still perhaps not enough. But this itself is another example of what we call information economics. Conflicts of interest are examples where the shareholder or that you're serving two masters, and you can't tell what is really the incentives, what is the person really doing. So modern economics of information had thrown a lot of light on the risk of these conflicts of interest, and again, on how government regulation can help prevent, reduce the extent of those conflicts of interest. Well, the phenomenon, to go back to what I was saying, that it was very clear to many of the firms, potential entrants into the industry, that there was not going to be zero profits. There were going to be monopoly profits, and therefore you had this enormous race, exacerbated in some ways by the failures of the stock market, the failures of information that provided capital to fuel this race, and you had excess entry, excess investment. Actually, this pattern of liberalization being followed by a boom with excessive investment, is one that one sees all over the world. And that was one of the things I found so interesting when I went to the World Bank. In the United States, we had seen it once before, the liberalization associated with financial market liberalization in the 80s. But if you look across the world, there are just literally dozens of examples. So it is something that we should have been more aware of, but was actually never discussed, never recognized as an anxiety. The cost to the U.S. economy has been enormous. It's not just the misallocation of resources during the boom, but the higher the boom, the worse the fall, and in the bust that followed the economy, as we all know, has been underperforming. And I've done a calculation on a moderate estimate of what the potential GDP is based on the productivity increases. The cumulative loss over the last 4 years between what the economy could have produced and what it actually produced is about $1.7 trillion. And even for a rich country, that's a lot of money. And if you think about what you could have done, what America could have done with $1.7 trillion, solve the Social Security problem, improve health, improve education, even if you want to maybe fight another war, depending on your preferences. But it was, in any case, or even provide maybe armor for our soldiers fighting in Iraq. So there were lots that you could have done with this $1.7 trillion. It is a large cost that has been associated with this boom and bust. What could have been done? Not a lot, but the one thing that I think that could have been done is to make an even stronger commitment to a strong antitrust policy. Because what fed the bubble was the belief that there were going to be large monopoly profits out there. And if one had made a clear statement that we aren't going to allow large monopoly profits, I think it would have dampened this bubble and the burst. The third topic the third and fourth topics that I want to talk about fairly briefly have to do with issues that I've encountered in my role as chief economist of the World Bank and the years since then, traveling around the world, and I spend most of my time traveling, most of the time in the sky these days. But the issues are very much, while they're international issues, they very much, I think, have some relevance to the United States. The first has to do with the role of media, and including television, radio, and democracy. It's an area that has received increasing amount of research. In a way, it is the corresponding part of my work on the economics of information. It's an area that I've been working more on, which is there's not only an issue of information and economic processes, there's an issue of information and political processes. And that just like bad information or distorted information, incomplete information has very large consequences for the performance of the economy, it also has some very large consequences for the performance of political processes. In several developing countries, there's been research trying to explore this, quite detailed empirical research exploring this. Simple issues like that in India, some work showing that the diversity of media, the number of newspapers, the number of radios, is systematically related to the quality of public services. That the media provides an important check on political processes, and that exposes problems, and that information leads to corrective measures that lead to an improvement in the quality of public services. Amartya Sen, who got the Nobel Prize in economics a couple of years before me, has emphasized that the role of information in famines. That when you have democracies and you have information, famines don't occur. That famines are associated not with a shortage of food, with a maldistribution of food. And if you know about where the food is not and where it's needed, the problem gets corrected. And therefore, in societies where there's not good information and not democracy, like China, there was a period in which 20 million people probably died of the famine. But in societies where you have good media, that these problems are checked. There is a growing sense, both in political science literature and I think more broadly, that democracy is more than going to the polls every 4 years or every 2 years. In other words, meaningful democracy is more than just electoral democracy. Emphasis on participation, meaningful participation. One word that is being used is the notion of contestability. Just like we talk about contestability of markets, competition of markets, political scientists are talking about contestability of political processes. Well, one aspect of this is that if you don't have a diversified media, you have much less contestability. You have much less ability to challenge the incumbent, to challenge either to throw him out or to challenge what his particular actions are, and therefore much less check. And there are a couple countries where one has seen the consequences of that, or is seeing the consequences of that, with a great deal of concern in the rest of the world. The example of the election in 1996 in Russia, where there's a great deal was made of the fact that they privatized the airwaves. There were two private television stations established. But what the view, if you go to Russia, you listen to what they say, well, the choice between having two oligarchs dictate the news and having the government dictate the news was not that much different. They still did not have accurate information. Now things are probably even worse because they have a government that has the ability to threaten the independent private so that they aren't really independent. Italy, which we think of as a modern democracy, you have 6 television stations out of the 7 controlled by the prime minister, 3 privately and 3 through the state ownership. And as a result, some people are questioning, is it able to be, in what sense are democratic principles being questioned? So I think it is the notion of media diversity, in my mind, is very important for democracy. What I'm talking about here is very different from notions of competition in media for economic reasons. It's not the market power of advertising, it's not market power that economists have talked about. It's a much more important. It's the ability to exercise a political power as a result of the control of the airwaves. There is, I think, in the United States, one other aspect of this that makes it worse, probably among the worst, that undermines, I think, the viability, in a sense, the effectiveness of our democracy. And that is the way we conduct campaigns. There's a lot of discussion about campaign finance reform, and it's focused on how you raise money and how much limits on money. But where does most of that money go? It goes to buy radio and TV time. So communications, the radio and TV, are at the root of the problems of our electoral system, of our campaign system. The airwaves ought to be viewed as a public good. It's a public asset. And what we've done is to privatize it, but privatize it in a way which I would argue undermines our democracy, because you turn it over to the, say, the networks, private stations. They then sell it. Oh. Oh, it's the airwaves. Wait. Okay. They then sell it. Competition among the parties, among the candidates, requires raising money, advertising, getting information, getting your side across. And so you have an arms race. Well, who are the people that are contributing? You have a lot of corporations, lots of other, a lot of interest groups contributing significant amounts. They're making investments. And when you make an investment, you expect a return. And they wouldn't be making the investment systematically year after year if they didn't get a return on those investments. And so the corruption of our political process is very much directly related to the privatization of the airwaves. Now, we debated this issue in a way in the early 90s. We said we ought to be auctioning off the spectrum. That was a privatization. But some of us said when we auction off the spectrum, we ought to preserve some public interest. That when you auction it off, you say, okay, but if you're going to be if you're going to buy this, still the public will maintain a certain, you have a certain public responsibility of providing so many hours of free time to say the political candidates. The amounts that could have been provided, it would have lowered revenue that you would have gotten in the sale, because you're saying that you can't sell this. But on the other hand, it would have completely changed the nature of our political process. You would not have these investments in the political campaigns. You would have had something that was really public, remaining public. You would have been able to say, if you can choose and raise your money any way you want, but if you do that, you won't be able to get these so many hundreds of millions of dollars worth of free airtime. So it seems to me that the fact, of course, in some cases we did double it. We didn't even auction off the airwaves. We tried, and we didn't even succeed in doing that. So we gave them away. But that means there is even a stronger argument, to the extent that it's been given away or that it was not a good auction. There's even a stronger argument for taking back those minutes, a fraction of those minutes, and recognizing that these are that they belong to the public, and that the way we are doing it now is very corrosive to our democracy. The final point I want to make is an issue that I talk about both in my book Globalization and Its Discontents and in Roaring 90s. I'm just going to spend a few minutes on it, but I talk a lot about the relationships between the United States and other countries, about the nature of globalization. There's been a lot of discontent with globalization, and for good reasons. With the end of the Cold War, we had the opportunity to change our international policy in all our area, including economics. For 40 years before that, every aspect of international relations were dictated by the Cold War. The enemy of my enemy was my friend. We could claim Pinochet as a friend of democracy, even as he was killing people and suppressing democracy. Why? Because he was anti-communist. But with the end of the Cold War, that imperative changed. But the end of the Cold War also meant that we were no longer we were no longer competing for you might say for the hearts and minds of people in the developing world. During the Cold War, we had to treat them fairly nicely because there was a competition. They could always go to Russia and say, can you do a better deal? So there was some attention paid to the well-being of the developing countries. So we were in this interesting position with the end of the Cold War. We could have either taken a more principled position, or we could take a more exploitive position. And in some areas, for a while at least, we did take a more principled position. In the areas of human rights, I think we did take a more principled position. But in the area of economics, we took a more exploitive position. And you saw that in the outcome, for instance, of the Uruguay round, the last round of trade negotiations that ended in 1994. It was so unfair. It wasn't just a question that the United States got the lion's share of the gains, or Europe, the advanced industrial countries as a whole. That everybody expected. But it was that the poorest countries in the world were actually worse off. They're actually made worse off. And that was because of the asymmetric way in which liberalization was done. We retained our cotton subsidies. Europe retained United States agricultural subsidies. Just to mention a couple of numbers, the average cow in Europe gets a subsidy of $2 a day. And that number has a certain resonance because $2 a day is the World Bank definition of poverty, and more than 2 billion people in the developing world live on less than $2 a day. So it's better to be a cow in Europe than to be a person in the third world. And the United States has the cotton subsidies where we spend $3 to $4 billion a year. Benefits go to 25,000, relatively few number, of very well-off cotton farmers. Meanwhile, to get that subsidy, they have to produce more, and that lowers the price of cotton. And it does damage to 10 million subsistence farmers in Africa. The damage is greater than our foreign aid. We don't even compensate them for the for the damage we do with our foreign aid. So these are all examples of showing of how inequitable, how we exercise the new opportunity for exploitation and devise a system that was more inequitable. Well, if you look at what has been going on in our international trade policy and other aspects of our economic policy, it's been characterized by hypocrisy, incoherency, inconsistency. Example of that, for instance, is, and this is bipartisan, during the Clinton administration, we talked about greater access to medicine. Healthcare reform was one of the big subjects as a basic, you might say, a basic human right, access to healthcare. But the intellectual property provision of the Oregon Round was called the TRIPS provision, had the effect of raising drug prices to levels that effectively made them unaffordable, and meant that when they signed the agreement in Marrakesh in 1995, they were effectively condemning to death thousands of people in Africa. The Council of Economic Advisors recognized this problem. We argued against the TRIPS agreement, but the pharmaceutical industry and the media industry were sufficiently strong that they dictated that agreement. Eventually, about 4 or 5 years later, it became clear what we had done, and there was international outrage, and there was a rolling back. But the problem continues and is in some ways getting worse, because now there's an attack on generic drugs in the developing countries. One example of this, I saw, I was in Morocco in February, and they were engaged in a negotiation of a bilateral trade agreement with the United States. Now, why did we choose Morocco? Well, obviously, it's not our next door neighbor. It's not the obvious country for synergies in trade. The obvious reason was that we wanted to show that we could interact in a meaningful way with a moderate Arab country. It was intended to build good relations. But the way we did our trade negotiations and what we demanded wound up hurting our relations. I talked to the people in the Moroccan government that were responsible for the negotiations. Said it's not a negotiation; it's a dictation. The United States says this is what you're going to get, and we have to take it. We talk, but they dictate the terms. And what were some of the things that they were that they were talking about? One of them was drugs, access to generic drugs. They wanted to make it more difficult to have access to generic drugs in Morocco than in the United States, even though Morocco is so much poorer. The reaction to this was so strong that in a country that normally does not have street demonstrations, there were protests. We were generating long-run hostility to the United States by this demand, which we won. But I want to mention this here at the FCC, partly because one of the areas where they were complaining was telecommunications. Because in a lot of our trade negotiations, telecommunications has become an issue. And again, I talked to the telecommunications minister, and he was very upset. What was his concern? Well, the country, a relatively poor country, has invested a lot in creating a cell phone network, actually a fairly good one. The United States' view was that that was a common facility. Any American firm should be able to come in and use that. They said, well, we invested in it. Why should you be able to come in and take away all our profits? Their view was, well, this is not a negotiation. You want to have a trade agreement with the United States? This is what you have to do. So while we debate these issues very actively in the United States, we understand that there are two sides. In our international agreements, we don't understand. That is to say, there's one side. It's the interest of the companies, international companies, who think they're going to make profit out of this. And we, as a country, are willing to sacrifice our long-run interest, in relations with other countries, with stability, in order to satisfy these particular special interests. Unfortunately, too few people know about it, question of information, and no political pressure has been brought to bear to do something about these issues. Well, I hope in this few minutes that I've given you a little flavor of at least some of the issues in telecommunications that I've had, reflections I've had in the last few years on some of the debates that we had in the White House, some of the debates we had at the World Bank, and since then. Let me open it up for questions. Right?
We've got a microphone here, so we'll try to use it, but Joe's mic is questions.
Okay.
Professor Stiglitz, question to follow up on your discussion of media diversity and impact on elections and intra-elections. I'm not disagreeing with your proposal to make it less expensive to get the ideas out, but I have a question whether how much that would do given one fact that scares me concerning the marketplace of ideas. And I look at the specific issue, factual issue, were there weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq after the fact? And my understanding is all of the major media firms reported back that we did not find any. Forget about the issue whether they were there, but we did not find any. And yet, it appears that 25% of the public who voted for George Bush believes we did find weapons of mass destruction. Now, that seems to me something different than a problem with the media reporting or media diversity, concentration, whatever. It's some other information problem that is, I would argue, distorting the system. Have you done any study of addressing that or even naming that issue, whether it's called denial or short-term versus long-term or something, but it's having a major impact on elections, and I think it needs to be addressed.
No, it's obviously a concern to anybody, and let me just say that media diversity does have some relevance even there, because the early coverage of the issue in Europe was quite different from the early coverage in the United States. And so, people's views of this were quite different over time in Europe than they were in the United States. You see that more, for instance, there was some actually very dramatic contrast in the coverage of Abu Ghraib, where we were days behind Europe. They had front page stories, and we had stories buried on page 8 in the more liberal newspapers, and not even talked about in other, barely in other newspapers. And people do form views, and there are theories about how people revise their views over time, and once a view gets formed, it's much harder. But let me make it very clear, what I propose is not a panacea. It's not going to solve the problem. I only think that it will make things better. I do think on the kind of issues that you raised, this may sound self-interested, but I think education has something to do with this. That the quality of our education system, a skeptical attitude, that needs to be better drained. How do you make inferences? We've not done as good in that kind of developing critical attitudes that as we should, and I think that has a lot to do with the failures in that area.
Yes, I've read some of your work regarding evaluation of the Big Bang privatization and how the dynamics can be such with asset stripping that it can lead to equilibria in which there's a lack of political demand for rule of law. Yep. And it sounds to me that some of what you're describing that's happening in this country is almost parallel to it, and that the kind of corruption going on in, as you indicated, with the lack of the transparency, that's a form of asset stripping in a different way from the shareholders. And then this phenomena with the media and also causing perhaps misinformation to the public. Am I correct or not in making some kind of analogy between the work you're saying there and actually dynamics that are going on in this country that actually in their own way could be contributing to erosion of the rule of law supporting some of these markets that we have tended to rely upon, but are we actually doing things now, eroding the rule of law in a developed country that's sort of analogous to what you were pointing out is happening with developing countries?
Yeah, I think that's an extremely good analogy. Let me just, for a moment, review what I said in the context of Russia and just spend a minute discussing the analogy. What happened in Russia is they had this it was called the sale of the century. They basically gave away the country's valuable natural resources to 10 oligarchs. I was in Russia last March, and they were talking to the senior people in the government. They estimate that $1 trillion was stolen. And you have the situation where these oligarchs got an enormous amount of money, and they didn't even have enough money to pay $10 per month to people on pensions. The average teacher in Russia today gets $500 a year. And so a society that had a very good education system is just being corroded. Now, part of the dynamic that I described there has twofold. One is, again, look at incentives. And the issue there was that if you had stolen, in effect, you've gotten this asset through political influence through Yeltsin, and then you're told you can take that asset and either keep it in Russia or strip it and move it to the United States. And by the way, if you keep it in Russia, one, the country's in depression, so you're not doing very well. But secondly, there could be another government. Yeltsin was known to be an alcoholic and having all kinds of problems. He's not going to stay in. Somebody's going to follow after him, and he may not be quite so favorable to you, which happened to be the case. So what would you do? What would incentives say? Well, the incentive said that take your money out. And so you have this vicious circle. The way you privatized it led to the weakening of the Russian economy, asset stripping, and as they did that, it made the economy weaker. You have this vicious cycle. But then the next part of the analysis says, let's look at the politics of this. There were some people who said, don't worry about the lack of rule of law. Once you privatize, it will create a demand for the rule of law. That's like saying, don't worry about competition. Rockefeller was not the strongest advocate of antitrust policy, nor probably is Bill Gates today. The fact is that if you have a monopolist, he's going to want to try to create a legal environment that maintains that monopoly and use his money to do that. Similarly, if you have laws that make it easier to strip assets, and you're in an environment where it's your incentive to strip assets, you're going to be pushing for laws like that rather than for a legal framework that is going to encourage wealth creation and investment. So the politics reinforces the economics. Well, the same thing is going on, I think, in the United States. I think you're exactly right. That in a way, those, there are the TVs, those who are making money out of the current arrangement, both the corporations who see a return on their investment, and the TV stations who see a return, making money by selling the TV ads, which in this last campaign were enormous. They have an incentive to keep the current system. Of course there will be nominal reforms. People get all excited and say we have to change, but they'll make the changes in ways that don't really change anything. So the incentive is to try to keep making superficial changes that make it look like you're responsive, but not to make the changes that will really make a difference, because there are strong forces who benefit from the current arrangement. And the problem is that in that sense it can be self-perpetuating and I think very destructive both to our economy and to our democracy.
I'd like to ask a question about trade policy. You certainly painted a parade of horribles here, and I'm just wondering if you might have any advice, at least in principle, for dealing with a situation where as we have, certain concentrated sectors are able to protect their interests, and you mentioned some of the agricultural sectors. I mean, even though it might not on the surface appear to be the fairest thing, one fairly obvious possibility is to try and use some of the gains that we get from these liberalization of trade with other countries to compensate the cotton producers or the sugar producers or whoever to maybe give up some of their sort of buy out some of their monopoly power. I mean, is there any is this at all politically feasible? And if not, do you have any other hope to offer in this area? Because it was kind of a grim portrayal, which I'm sure is accurate.
Yeah, the view. There was one senior U.S. Official who, when the sub-Saharan African countries that grow cotton in semi-arid areas were complaining, he said, "Well, why don't you get into another business?" These are countries that in which there is no alternative. I mean, and it was not a remark that engendered a lot of warmth in those countries. Well, this is an interesting case because America as a whole would benefit from getting rid of the cotton subsidies. So we lose. We lose internationally, we lose domestically. My greatest hope is what is actually happening in the developing countries. The failure of the talks in Cancun, there were the ministerial talks, which was a halfway point in what was the so-called development round negotiations, broke down. And the reason it broke down in part was, I viewed it as a triumph of democracy and greater transparency. Because they were, what was happening is the first time that there was greater transparency in what was going on in the negotiations, people in Delhi could see what was going on in Cancun. And what happened was, in effect, I had a lot over the years a lot of discussions with the U.S. trade representatives, and they always say, we agree, we're terribly unfair. It shouldn't be, but they say our hands are tied because of Congress. Well, what happened in Cancun was the developing countries came back and said, we like being in office. Our hands are tied. If we come back with another agreement as unfair as the Uruguay round, we're going to be out of office. And so the debate has been one in which the developing countries say we have democracies and they're tying our hands to have a fair agreement. You have a democracy because of your flawed democracy. It says you have to have an unfair agreement. Well, the moral weight of the developing countries is quite strong on that. And eventually, I think they will prevail. On some of these issues, there is progress already being made for an interesting reason. The WTO, for all its flaws, for all its unfairness, helped create a rule of law in international trade. And it goes back to what I view as the importance of having a rule of law. So what did that mean? Brazil, after the failure of Cancun, brought a case against the United States on cotton subsidies. The United States said the cotton subsidies, there's a provision in the, this is a very lawyerly kind of thing to do. In the Uruguay round, these documents that go on hundreds of pages, there were a lot of fine print. And one of the things that was done was a provision that said you can increase your everybody thought the United States had committed to reducing farm subsidies. There was a little provision, fine print, that said but it's okay to have non-trade distorting subsidies, whatever that meant. Well, the United States, as you know, has doubled its farm subsidies. And what we claim is that they're all non-trade distorting. And in this particular case, the United States claimed that its cotton subsidies are not trade distorting. Well, I don't think you could find a respectable economist in the world that would agree with the U.S. position. It's a little bit embarrassing having your government take these kinds of positions. And they got somebody from UC Davis in the United States to testify of what, to do the econometric studies to show what every economist, I mean, it wasn't a breakthrough research, it's what everybody would have recognized. And interestingly, enormous pressure was put on him to be fired. He was labeled as disloyal. But fortunately, we have tenure, and he was not fired. But the outcome, the point was that Brazil appears to have prevailed, as it was almost inevitable that it would. And the United States will probably be forced to get rid of its cotton subsidies. Now, there are other kinds of incentives to try to make a more balanced regime. This demand by developing countries to have a fair trade agreement means that if we want another agreement, our exporters want another agreement, want more access, there's going to have to be, I think, more concessions. And it's that kind of hard bargaining that I think is going to get some results in moving to a fairer trade regime. Unfortunately, it won't be based on principle. I mean, it was very, just as, again, another aside, but the difference between the argumentation and analysis that goes on in the international arena and the domestic arena, I always found astounding. In the domestic arena, when you're trying to put forward a position, a policy, a perspective, you always argue for it in terms of general interest. I've never heard anybody say, I want this because it's going to make me rich. That's not an argument that is acceptable. You have to say, we're going to have a better telecommunication system. We're going to have a more productive agriculture. There's always a general argument that you need, and the effect on my income is just incidental to these general benefits that all of society are going to receive. So that's the way all the argument, I found it always amusing, this is the way all the arguments go on in the White House, and I think that's true in every administration. But in the international arena, there is absolutely no pretense in principle. The argument is, our guys want it, we got to give it to them. And so, the fact that the word social justice, fairness, are just not in the vocabulary. So I think that has been one of the things that's colored a lot of what has gone on. And so you winds up in this kind of hard bargaining.
A comment with regard to the analogy between Russia and the United States and Big Bang privatization. As background, I lived in Russia from 1994 to 97, and I worked at an organization called the Russian Privatization Center, and I was supposed to be advising the Russian Anti-Monopoly Committee on establishing independent regulatory institutions. I didn't just parachute in once in a while, and I did live and work there, and I do speak Russian. I do want to say that you made some comment that you said something to the effect that Big Bang privatization made the economy worse in Russia. And I'm not going to defend mass privatization. I'm not sure I believe in it myself, but what I do want to say is I'm not sure that mass privatization made the Russian economy worse. It was already pretty bad because of 70 years of socialism. With regard to the analogy between Russia and the United States, I mean, I'm not going to say that sometimes sitting here I often have a feeling of deja vu, but I think that these are sort of often natural consequences anytime you have bureaucratic organizations or politics involved in resource allocation and so on and so forth. But addressing the analogy more directly, I think anybody who thinks that that there is, that there's some kind of analogy or similarity between the United States and Russia ought to live in a country like that, as I did for 3 years. And I think you'll find that there is a huge difference, and I'd be very careful about, I think it's oversimplified to draw those kinds of analogies.
Okay. I don't think either I meant the analogy wasn't what happened to the outcome. I mean, there's a vast difference. I think I would agree with you. It's just incomparable. But the point is that there are political processes and the interaction between the political forces and economic forces. It's that dynamic that is the analogy. With adverse outcomes. I mean, even the adverse outcomes in the United States are nowhere near as perhaps even the best outcomes in Russia. But the dynamics of those forces are what we were, at least I thought was, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
If airtime should be assigned to politicians for free during campaigns, presidential campaigns at least, how do you think they should allocate the time between different politicians, and in particular, what about the possibility that someone who may not doesn't a fairly obscure politician to begin with, who's not a candidate of either major party, might have the potential of raising a lot of money by grassroots, an internet, raise a lot of money, grassroots money, and have an impact how can you with a system where your airtime is given away for free, how would that guy be heard?
Okay. Well, 2 points. Nothing would, I certainly would not argue that for those who do not get free time, that there should be any restrictions on their buying time, so they could still do that. I would actually think that the issues of contestability would suggest that you want to provide time to dissident voices, maybe in excess of the proportion of their potential votes. There are difficult questions of how you're going to allocate it, but we allocate we allocate public funds for campaign already. And what this is just allocating airtime. It's another form of money that is ineffective money, but that reduces the need for budgetary support, and hopefully will create a more level playing field. But I do think that there is probably a need to have third-party voices heard more loudly. And they played historically an important role in the evolution of American politics.
Hello, Mr. Stiglitz. I actually have a couple of questions. First of all, about the contestable market, that you just said that a market that is highly contestable would prevent competition because the profits are likely to be zero. And a libertarian would argue that the market, if I'm an investor and I want to invest, I have the right over my money, and I know if I'm going to get into this market, and if I don't, I can always pull back. So how would you go against that?
The notion of sunk cost is that if you pull back, you lose the money. And so that's why sunk cost is a critical part of the story. But the point is that there's always some sunk cost. So you can never pull back and maintain your being whole.
Where about in the markets that the sunk costs are negligible? It's almost zero.
The theorem that I proved was that even if there is negligible but positive, small but positive, it had a market effect on industrial structure. Now, it's like any theorem. It's meant to highlight a particular point. The point is that competition can be very fragile, and that you need to be very sensitive to the possibility of the breakdown of competition. That's really the point. Not that I believe that extreme model. From a technical point of view, it requires what we call Bertrand competition in the aftermarket. But it qualitatively, I think, makes I think, an important point.
One more thing. In your book, Globalization and its Discontents, you argue that there has to be some kind of regulation in the way capitals are invested in these less developed countries. In the case of small countries, if a small country like my country, Peru, impose a regulation on like the time frame that the capitals can get in and go out, the most likely is like investors won't go to this small country, but would go to another country that they don't have these different regulations. This kind of create a prisoner dilemma for all these small countries, and they would act not to regulate at all these capitals, and you can end up with the debacle that you had on the 97. So what would you do? Like,
okay. The issue that's being raised for those is that in my book, Globalization is Discontent, I talked about a particular policy that was strongly advocated by the IMF and the U.S. Treasury at the time, which was allowing capital, speculative capital, to come in and out of a country without restrictions. And the argument is that you can't build factories on the basis of money that can come in and out overnight, but that money coming in and out overnight does contribute enormously to instability. So the critical question is, can you intervene, reduce this free flow of capital coming in and out without having adverse effects on real growth? And the evidence is overwhelming that you can. That is to say, to give you one other country like south of you, Chile, had restrictions on short-term capital inflows. It had no adverse effect on long-term capital inflows. So yes, some of the short-term capital inflows were dampened. But those short-term capital inflows are unrelated to economic growth in the long run. The kind of capital that's related to economic growth in the long run is foreign direct investment, long-term investment, and that is not adversely affected by those particular regulations. There can be other regulations that discourage foreign direct investment and long-term investment, and you should try to reduce those regulations.
I believe we have time for one or two short questions.
I was wondering if you had any comments you would like to share with us at the FCC about the extent to which FCC policies or rules in recent years have encouraged competition in the telecommunications market.
I actually don't have a strong view of, I haven't looked at that close enough to have, I know it's extremely controversial. One of the things that has struck me, and I think other observers, not only in the United States but other countries, is that even when there are a large number of cell phone carriers, for instance, profits remain very high. And so there are issues of what are the impediments to the effectiveness of competition? Why does it take a lot of very peculiar forms of special deals and but not lower prices of the kind that will lead profits to a much lower to a more reasonable level. I think that if you compare the United States with some other countries, we've done a better job. So compared to Mexico, for instance, we have where they have effectively a monopoly in a large part of their system. You can see the effect that where prices are quite high. You can see the effect of this, that competition can make a difference. But Well, let me just say that's all I would want to say at this.
Yes, I'd be very interested in your views on the relative role between antitrust and regulation. You spoke earlier about the risk of regulatory capture and about the need for antitrust oversight. I know in many parts of the world, including Europe, which I've studied a fair bit, antitrust is seen in many ways as an ex post complement to ex ante regulation, whereas here they're more nearly mutually exclusive. I'd be very interested in your views.
Yeah, I view them as complements. I mean, I think that's a general area, in my view, in trying to manage the economy, you need both ex ante and ex post. You need ex ante regulation, for instance, in areas that lead to damages, tort. But then you also need ex post remedies like liability laws. So this combination of ex ante and ex post, partly because there are advantages of both of these. It is costly to have enforcement mechanisms, and ex post enforcement is difficult, and the damages are often difficult to undo. Let me give you an example of an in the area of where there are strong network externalities, like in software operating systems. There's a view that once you become dominant through unfair practices, even if you say then, don't engage in those practices anymore, you sign an agreement, I'll never do it again, it doesn't, time is, you can't get a remedy. That once a monopoly power has been established, it's very hard to undo. So it's better to ex ante stop the monopoly power from being generated, because once it's there, figuring out an appropriate remedy is really difficult. So in my mind, I think that they ought to be viewed as complements, and exactly how you where the boundaries are. You don't want to have the argument against too strong regulation ex ante is that it stifles innovation. That's what people worry about. It stifles doing things in a different way. But I think there are forms of regulation that can have limited adverse effects. And so you want to, it's not only the amount, areas, it's the type of regulation. Let me just give one example in another area. I talked before about about accounting. You could say, let's just have ex post actions. If the accounting firm doesn't do a good job, sue. That provides the incentives for good behavior. Why have an ex ante regulation saying that you can't have a conflict of interest? Well, the answer is, quite often, it's very expensive to sue. And secondly, when the mistake is big enough, as in the case of Arthur Andersen and Enron, you go bankrupt and you can't recover. The damage is in some sense not easily to be repaired. The regulation saying that if you're an accounting firm, you have to do accounting, has some cost, but it's relatively little. You have to say, what is the magnitude in a technical term of the economy of scope between that activity and other activities? You say, well, that's not that great, so the cost of imposing that no conflict of interest rule is relatively low. The benefits are enormous, and that's an ex ante regulation that avoids a lot of ex post action. So I think the same thing in areas of competition policy, trying to prevent areas that are likely to lead to anti-competitive practices is often easier than remedy the consequences.
Okay, I'll exercise the option to ask one last question that I thought was sure going to be asked, but I'll ask and try to really put Joe on the spot. Joe, do you have any comments about the enforcement of our indecency laws?
Well, in general, I have a high toleration for free speech, and I think that the stance of saying, well, during prime time, you need to be maybe careful because you might expose people to that shouldn't children and so forth. I think makes some sense, but that a lot of this is it may be, as an information economist, we tend to I tend to look for information remedies, like saying on movies there is violence, sex, whatever. You should have disclosure about what's there, but not suppression. And I guess I would, as you start worrying about what is indecency, I guess I worry as much about violence and what it does as these self-righteous concerns about indecency.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Joe.